Hello, good afternoon, and welcome. Thank you for taking the time and for joining us today to listen and see a little bit about how this drive of green and fair electronics is gathering steam and how it's getting stronger as we move ahead. We have the privilege of having today experts with a deep and wide area of expertise on occupational health and safety, on the area of policy, research, technical evaluation based on life cycle, but also on the form of how a purchaser can move ahead and be part of this sustainable ICT revolution with TCO. My name is Rakesh Wazirani. I'm with TÜV Rheinland, based here in Hong Kong. And let's have a short look at what we will be covering today and what are the talking points. We will start off looking on a high level with regards to what are the primary impacts with regards to ICT and electronics and what are these drivers for change which have been mobilized. Thereafter, we look at the occupational health and safety aspect and how these should be and can be safeguarded in the supply chain with Ms. Omana George, who's with Electronics Watch. And then we'll have a look at the big picture in terms of the hotspots in the supply chain and the policy instruments, along with some recommendations from Mr. Siddharth Prakash, who's with the OCO Institute based in Germany. Finally, we look at one practical example of how an eco-label like the TCO certified addresses many or most of these points in terms of hotspots and how it supports purchasers to be part of this sustainable IT revolution. But as we start off, I suppose it's also important for us to know who is joining us today. Yeah? So we have participants from primarily from Asia and Europe. We also have some registrants from America, and I hope that they are sleeping well in bed and that they have a look at the recording later on. So konnichiwa, ni hao, namaste, salam, bonjour, guten morgen to all of you. Thank you for joining. We also see that the participants today, they represent various sector or subsectors or players in the supply chain. So we have, of course, the brands, retailers. We also have researchers, consultants, governments, associations, NGOs, consumers, and also third-party verification organizations participating today. So perhaps it gets important now to know a little bit about all of you and the kind of ICT products you are using in your life. So if we may have the first poll, and if you could please share your feedback in terms of which of these products you'll actually have and use. So for example, mobile phones, laptop computers, tablets, whether you use them at work or at home for personal use. If you all could please select here, that gives us an impression of what are the kind of products you are familiar with, you are using. Yeah. And I think let's then have a quick look at the results. Ryan, should we have a look at the results? All right. Okay. So most of us are using a laptop computer, but also mobile phones, tablets, additional screen, printers, extra battery. And all of that also showcases what's happening today with the mobile phones that we have controlling many things around us, from a coffee maker to a vacuum cleaner to opening our garage doors. And that's somehow part of what we see in our life today. Yeah? It's an electrification of every can be looked at when we take a big picture of what the supply chain or supply web of a laptop computer is. Yeah. So this is an example that has been around for quite some time, where we see raw materials are mined somewhere, then components are manufactured, and then subcomponents assembled finally, and then ending up with consumers in different parts of the world. And if we look at the same supply web in a simplified version for a mobile phone, then it's typically a phone being manufactured by one of these large assembly houses. And that assembly house or the company purchasing a lot of these components from various component manufacturers, which purchase via traders and then goes further upstream in smelting and so on. And all of that has an impact. So there are several touch points, and all of those touch points have impact. So there's this really nice graphic from Make ICT Fair, which showcases the overall supply chain of ICT products, starting from the raw materials, going through the smelters, design, production, distribution, the use phase, and end of life, and the related impacts from health and safety perspective, from environmental perspective, and so on. Today, we'll touch upon a little bit with regards to the impact and potential benefits when extending the lifetime, let's say, and addressing the occupational health and safety aspects, or encompassing all of these impacts via criteria of an eco-label. But as we talk about the impacts, the challenges and the opportunities, it's useful to see what you all provided as feedback in terms of what you see as the major roadblocks for this green IT revolution. Yeah. So you all provided feedback that there's lack of harmonization. There's this perception of higher cost when an ICT product is certified, let's say, is greener or fairer. There's also this challenge that there aren't enough incentives for large purchasers to purchase greener, fairer products. And there's lack of harmonization also in terms of criteria, standards, and so on. Yeah. So with that, let's say overall, to have these wheel of progress for green and fair ICT, to push it and to make it move, we need to understand the hotspots, yeah, which is what we looked at with the graphic. We need to see what's happening in terms of the policies from governments, what's happening in terms of the demand and commitment, both from the brands, but also, or the manufacturers, but also from the purchasers. And then if there is money on the table to support companies to go greener, to become more fair, and the availability of technical standards to evaluate the greenness or the fairness of products. So we see that while the hotspots have been identified, there's also focus from NGOs, example, Greenpeace, which has been looking at various IT companies, looking at the various criterias, and then providing them a rating to kind of showcase which one is doing more and which one is talking about what they are doing and which one needs to do much more, perhaps. Yeah. We also see that there are now standards from financial reporting perspective, the SASB standard, for example, where large ICT companies which are listed on the stock exchange, they can now report on how many of their products have, let's say, Energy Star certification or reports to look at energy efficiency, how many of them are containing harmful substances, how many of them have a particular eco-label for their products, yeah, and how many of them have reviewed their supply chain with, let's say, the EICC or the RBA audit. Example of companies which are doing this is already Apple, Samsung, Xerox, LG, Asus, HP, and so on. These companies are already reporting on these criteria such that investors be able to review the KPIs amongst these companies, and then based on those KPIs and metrics, be able to decide which one has better opportunity or less risks. Yeah. We also see that countries are taking action. So many of these countries are signatories to the Paris Agreement, and they have committed to support the Sustainable Development Goals. Example indicators for goal number 12 is the target and the indicator with regards to public procurement using greener practices. Yeah. So in Europe, we already see, for example, there are GPP or Green Public Procurement criteria for computers, monitors, smartphones, and so on available. We also see policy drivers, for example, the European Green Deal, which ties together with the Circular Economy Action Plan, which has particular focus on electronics and ICT, which is what we'll be talking about today. Then we also see that there are eco-labels which are there on the market, and there's a mapping which has been produced, whereby for the different criteria for government procurement, green public procurement, there's information on which eco-label already addresses these criteria, such that a purchaser then can easily look at the products from the suppliers and see if they have already these eco-labels. And if they do, then it means that it fulfills the requirements. it goes a step further when we talk about taking care of these products and extending the lifespan of these products such that less waste is generated and to reduce the adverse impact. Yeah. So we see one example from France with the repairability index, and then there's this wider goal on Europe level to have a similar criteria developed to allow consumers to have this right to repair. And we see this nice combination of policy drivers, green public procurement in Europe, then standards and policies and regulations with regards to energy efficiency, with regards to eco-design, and with regards to a label which addresses all of those hotspots. Yeah, considering that on a country level, public procurement has a significant impact and potential with 14% of GDP contribution. So Europe has taken this approach of combining these policy measures and tools to help them achieve the indicators that they have committed to. But we also see multi-stakeholder initiatives, such as this circular electronics partnership, which was announced earlier this year, whereby companies, associations, governments together, they commit to having increased circularity in the electronics that they purchase. Brands, they commit to having increased circularity in terms of the products that they manufacture, and that these risks in the supply chain on occupational health and safety and social aspects are also reviewed and addressed. Another example of this is the CFIT, or the Circular and Fair ICT Pact, where there are governments from Netherlands, Germany, UK, Switzerland, Austria, and so on, which have also come together. And they also will be launching and releasing further details later this year, indicating what they expect from the brands and retailers who are providing them ICT products in terms of environmental and social aspects. So looking at the wheel once again, we saw a little bit about the hotspots. We saw about the policies. We also saw about this demand and commitment from brands, from multi-stakeholders, but also from the large companies like Apple, Samsung, NEC, and so on, with the science-based targets commitment. So we see that somehow this wheel now is moving ahead. And that's what we will look at a little further. So one of the aspects that we will start off with is the impact in the supply chain. And as we start off listening to Ms. Omana from Electronics Watch, perhaps you all can give your feedback on what you feel in terms of approximately how many workers you feel have touched components or the phone that you have in your hand in the supply chain prior to that phone coming to a retailer and you purchasing this from the shop. Yeah. So before you got the phone in your hand, what do you feel? How many workers would have touched the phone? So it would be less than 5. You think it's between 6 and 10 workers, between 10 and 20, or more than 20 workers? Yeah. Let's have a quick look at the results then. Okay. Thank you for that feedback. I think, Omana, that positions us well, because your organization and what you've been doing over the past 17 plus years has been focusing to make sure that occupational health and safety is safeguarded in the supply chain, that these workers are taken care of. Yeah. Yes. And I think it's apt that we start listening from you, from the social impact before we move ahead.
Thank you, Rakesh. And thank you for that poll. It's really good to see the results, because truthfully speaking, we really don't know how many people handle the mobile phones and the different gadgets we use, because a lot about the supply chains, we really don't know what is the impact of it on workers and how it affects them. So I'm going to delve a little deeper in my presentation to look at what are the occupational health and safety problems faced by electronics workers. And before I start, let me just introduce myself very briefly. My name is Omana George. and I'm the monitoring coordinator with Electronics Watch. And normally I'm located in Hong Kong, but with the pandemic and lockdowns, I'm temporarily based in India now. So before I go into my presentation, I want to give you a brief intro into my organization. Electronics Watch is an independent monitoring organization that helps public sector organizations work together to protect the rights of workers in their supply chains. And Electronics Watch collaborates with these public sector buyers who are our affiliates and with civil society organizations in the different regions where electronics production is going on and experts. We do the investigations and monitoring, and our monitoring is always worker-driven monitoring. Now, this slide is basically to give you a snapshot about who our public buyers are and where they are located. We have around 330 public buyer organizations located in 7 countries who share the cost of monitoring the supply chains and coordinate engagement with the industry through Electronics Watch. And we have monitoring partners right now located in 11 countries. They are Czechia, Bolivia, DRC, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Poland, Thailand, Vietnam, and China. And we're also looking at new partnerships in Hungary. This slide is just to give you a snapshot of the different kinds of organizations we work with who are our public buyers. They can be government bodies, they can be municipal corporations, they can be universities. In fact, we've just now we have a new partner in Australia, Curtin University. That's our first partnership in Australia. And there are some in this slide you can see which are underlined. These are basically consortiums. So it's more than one organization in those. For example, the Swedish County Council has 21 members. LUPC UK has 78 members, just to give you an idea. Okay, now what products do we cover in our monitoring? We look at electronic supply chains from components through to final assembly. And Rakesh showed a slide earlier about from Eclair, right, or Make ICT Fair, on the whole life cycle. That's exactly what we are trying to do. Right now, we are in the pilot phase of monitoring in the mineral part of the supply chain, and we are looking at mining, smelters, and refineries. And we are starting to do monitoring work in both the DRC, Bolivia, and the Philippines in this phase of the life cycle. And in the future, we aspire to expand from ICT to electronics in the medical technology and also batteries in electric vehicles. But that is a little bit off right now. At the moment, our focus is the areas I mentioned earlier. Okay, now this is everything. This is a core of what Electronics Watch does. Worker-driven monitoring. This is how we do our work. We engage with our partners on the ground, our monitoring partners, who are very well recognized, established, and respected civil society organizations. With workers at the center, we do our monitoring. And workers can also initiate monitoring processes by reaching out to Electronics Watch and monitoring partners and telling us about problems in the factory. And they also are connected to the whole monitoring process. They understand what is the results and how the engagement is going on. And they also help us develop the solutions. So everything we do is basically to support workers and to protect their rights. Okay, now the next slide. This is basically the core of our presentation, where I'm going to talk to you about the common occupational health and safety concerns. Researchers and civil society organizations in countries all across the world over the decades have highlighted common occupational health and safety areas of concern that workers in the electronic sector face. They handle hundreds of chemicals that are toxic to the skin, respiratory system, reproductive system, and the central nervous system. Some of the common concerns we have seen repeatedly is that workers do not know what are the chemicals they are working with. Or sometimes they know just the commercial name. For example, workers might tell us they're working with banana oil, which is an industrial solvent, which is used to clean the surfaces of screens, the phone screens. But banana oil also contains a substance called N-hexane, which causes damage to the nervous system. Workers may not be aware of the hazards of the chemicals they work with. If they don't know what the hazards are, how can they take adequate protection to take care of themselves and protect their health? So this limits their ability to choose safe employment. And then it's also very common that they do receive some training, but they may not be the right kind of training to handle the chemicals safely, or it's not adequate enough, the training they receive. So they may be still handling chemicals which are deadly in nature and don't understand its toxicity and how to protect themselves effectively against it. Most of the workers in the production of the electronic sector tend to be young women workers, generally across the globe, if you see this. And these are young women of childbearing age. So exposure to toxins, many of the toxins being used in this sector can cause reproductive and developmental health impacts on children who could be exposed to chemicals in utero while the mother is pregnant. The other important point I want to make is occupational health and safety standards tend to be significantly lower than environmental standards for the same toxins. And thus they may not be protective enough for workers. So this means that the worker has lesser protection from the same chemical than the consumer of the product, even though they work in factories with these chemicals and may be exposed to them for a longer period of time. And this is really important for us to keep in mind. And high production targets can result in long working hours, and this can cause longer exposure to hazardous materials, fumes, chemicals, and radiation in the workplace. Then the other problem is workers are working in precarious forms of employment, such as temporary contracts, traineeships, apprentices, internships, or employment through third-party agencies, depriving workers of the security and the ability to speak up because they are scared they will lose their job. So they don't really want to speak up and they keep quiet about it. And finally, workers in the supply chains are often migrant workers. And you will see this across many countries. So because they're migrant workers and because they move so often from job to job, when they do fall sick, they may not be able to eventually connect their illness to where the exposure happened at work, right? And they may not be able to monitor themselves effectively over a period of time. Now, I want to give you one example of impact of a case we worked with in Indonesia. Here, the substance which workers were exposed to is called toluene. We found that workers are using this as a cleaning solvent, and this substance is a reproductive toxin. So it can decrease the fertility of the women workers who are working with this chemical. It can also result in the loss of fetus during pregnancy and harm the developing baby with birth defects and other problems. As the baby grows, it's a neurotoxin and it can also impact the central nervous system. So when we did our investigation in Indonesia, during the monitoring process, workers testified that this substance, toluene, is being used as a cleaning solvent. Fainting was a common occurrence in this factory, right? And also there was excessive production quotas, which led to high levels of stress. So in addition to being exposed to this chemical, they were also having high levels of toxin, which therefore makes the impact of the chemical even more stronger on their bodies. So then Electronics Watch communicated with brands and asked that toluene be replaced with safer alternatives. And with the active engagement, this particular chemical was completely removed from the production process. And the ventilation system was repaired, and PPE, personal protective equipment of higher grade quality, was given to the workers. Now, what is the actions? We've spoken a lot about problems. Now let's look at a little bit about actions. What kind of actions do we need to take to make workplaces safer and to protect workers' health? First point is about transparency, so that workers and the communities even living around the factories, because there's environmental impact of chemicals being used inside the workplace, know what's being used, know what steps should be taken to protect themselves, right? Second is, if we know a certain chemical is a mutagen or a reproductive toxin or a carcinogen, then we make active steps to remove this toxic chemical and use a safer substitute. And then the third point is about protecting workers, making sure they go effective training on safe handling of chemicals, making sure they go through medical checks. There's industrial monitoring being done in the factory so that we can ensure safety and health of workers. And if workers do come up with some problem, they should have the space to negotiate with the management, so there's no retaliation and backlash when they want to engage on a particular chemical to make changes in the workplace. And then guaranteeing participation, respecting the efforts of workers and communities when they want to engage in the management of chemicals and waste in the workplace or in the surrounding areas. This would include building effective occupational health and safety committees in the factory and training programs. Protecting communities and the environment, prevent harm throughout the life cycle of the chemicals by conducting effective, transparent, independent monitoring of the discharge streams which are coming out of the factory, make sure treatment is being done before waste is being discharged, and eliminating hazardous discharge into the environment. Finally, it's about compensation. If we know harm has been done, if workers have died, or if workers have fallen sick, or if the community is impacted, timely justice and compensation and relief is absolutely essential. So this is some of the points I wish to illustrate. Now, I want to bring your attention to this guidance we released at the end of last year, which is on how to protect workers from chemical hazards in the electronic supply chain. This is a guidance for public buyers, and it gives steps all along the whole procurement process, what kind of steps public buyers can take to address chemical usage in the supply chains where their products are being procured from. And this is on our website. I urge all of you to go and take a look at it. Okay, there are two principles I want to bring to your attention. The first one is about the precautionary principle. And this is like really important, because here companies should take action. When we know a certain thing causes a harmful impact, the ideal way is to prevent that from happening. So if companies can take a proactive approach and have a better safe than sorry approach than actually exposing workers to harm, that is the best way forward. And this is really important when it's a situation where harm which is done is irreversible. Like I was mentioning to you about developmental changes to the fetus or reproductive changes, cancers, these kind of situations, then we don't want this to happen. We try to avoid it. And most importantly, the precautionary principle shifts the blame onto the employer and the person who's exposing the workers than the worker trying to prove that they were exposed and felt sick because of the conditions in the workplace. So this is really important. The burden of proof shifts. Okay. The next point I want to show you, this is very important. This is a hierarchy of control. Now, when there is a hazard in a workplace, this is the standard protocol we apply to ensure that we can keep workplaces safe and workers healthy. So the first step should always be to eliminate the hazard, to remove it altogether. In a particular situation, if we are not able to do that, then we try to bring a safer substitute. And if let's say that chemical doesn't have a safer substitute, or if they can do it, but they need some time to remove the chemical. So they have a timeline set in place, right? But in the meantime, what do? We can do two things. We can do engineering control, where if there is particular fumes or things coming onto the workers, we can have exhaust systems. We can have the production process isolated, that particular process, so that the workers are isolated from the hazard. Finally, we can have something called administrative control, where you change the way people work. This is actually not ideal, because it's like saying, oh, we have this really hazardous situation. Now we will make sure workers are exposed to it only for like 1 hour every day. And then we'll have a rotation and we'll bring the next set of workers and expose them to the hazard. So it's basically the problem's there and we're just going around it, but you haven't really solved the problem. So this is not ideal. And the final step always should be looking at personal protective equipment. So generally, when we are talking to workers and we are looking at how to make workplaces safe, we never push for PPE as a first step. Elimination of the hazard should be the first step. Now, Rakesh was asking me to have a little bit of a reflection on this German supply chain law. We don't have any official organization position yet on this law, but I'll share some initial reflections from Electronics Watch on the law. And for this, I wish to reference the letter written by John Ruggie, who's a UN Secretary General Special Representative for Business and Human Rights, and also the author of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. A couple of points I want to draw to your attention is that Electronics Watch, we, as you understand already from my presentation, our core method of working is worker-driven monitoring. So with this in mind, we have two principles we want to highlight as good, and we really welcome it. One is using the precautionary principle. Companies are expected to examine how their own purchasing practices may help to mitigate human rights and environmental risks. Second, when the law comes into effect, which is, I think, in 2023, stakeholder engagement has been emphasized. The German Works Council will be able to look at workers' interests along the supply chain to strengthen workers' rights, human rights, and environmental standards. Though this is a start, there have been some areas of concern which John Ruggie has highlighted, and I want to share a few with you. First thing, the supply chain law is talking about companies that only employ at least 3,000 workers, okay? And later on, they are going to look at companies with about 1,000 workers. But the problem is, generally, all the problems we see in the supply chain when we do our monitoring comes lower down in the supply chain. It's in the tier 2, tier 3 factories and below. So that means we're not going to really address a lot of the problems. They're all going to be there because we're just going to look at the top level. So that's a huge problem. And I really want to point that out. Even though this law makes reference to the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines, it does seem to be, though, lower than them in terms of standards. And the first example is with the supply chain, because both the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines talk about covering the whole supply chain. And the second thing is the draft law does not address the need for companies to focus their attention on individuals and communities who can be affected by their operations and in their supply chain. But the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines accept stakeholder engagement throughout the entire due diligence process to include the perspective of all respective stakeholders. And if it's not possible for the stakeholders to directly engage, then their representatives can engage on their behalf. That's not there here. Finally, I want to say that Electronics Watch supports mandatory human rights due diligence in principle and stakeholder engagement throughout the due diligence process as described by the OECD guidelines. This includes workers' co-determination of remedy. We hope that the recommendations given by John Ruggie and the civil society in Germany will be addressed. And that's my comment on the German supply chain. And I'll finally leave you with a slide with my contact information if you wish to get in touch with me. Thank you for your time.
Right. Excellent. Thank you, Omana, for talking about what Electronics Watch is doing for the workers, for the supply chain, and your areas of focus. There are a few questions which we will take up at the end, unless you want to add something with regards to your recent collaboration with RBA. If you want to talk a little bit about the terms and focus of that collaboration. Omana, or
I can do that. You want me to do that now or later?
Yeah. Please, if you can maybe talk about.
So Electronics Watch, along with, has been in communication with the RBA. This process is going on even before I joined this organization. I've only been with them for a year and a half, but it is to have a meaningful terms of engagement when we do a monitoring process. We've outlined 19 steps of engagement, right from the start of monitoring when we come to engage with the RBA and companies on resolving the issues we have found out in our monitoring process. So they could be a violation of a law, or if it is not a violation, it still could be a harmful situation, and then we have recommendations. And so this is our process of engagement. And so this terms of engagement actually streamlines our communication process, clearly laying out how we will engage, what are the different steps. And you can go and look at these terms of engagement on our website and also the RBA website. Right. I hope that's sufficient.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Omana. And we look forward to Electronic Watch's work for the other industry sectors within electronics. Yeah, thanks a lot. So having looked at the worker perspective and occupational health and safety, let's talk a little bit about the hotspots in terms of environment, the policies which are around. And what's happening today. So for that, we will have Mr. Siddharth Prakash, who is a senior researcher with OCO Institute in Germany. His focus is on policy research concerning sustainable production and consumption and circular economy. He and his team advises the European Commission, governments both in Germany but also elsewhere. And I guess before Siddharth starts to give us a deep dive, Ryan, maybe we can pull up the poll to get an idea on what phone are we using in the audience. If you are comfortable sharing this anonymous feedback, what phone you are using, it gives us also some idea, some perspective on the choices that you have available and what you have selected. All right. And I think, Ryan, let's have the results also to get a perspective. Okay. All right. So we see iPhone, Samsung, and so on. All right. Great. And also other. All right. With that, Siddharth, please enlighten us with regard to hotspots, policy, and the work that OCO Institute is doing.
Oh, thanks a lot, Rakesh. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Perfect. So thanks a lot for inviting me to give a talk on the ICT hotspots. And in the beginning, I would just like to say that I will not be able to cover all the hotspots of ICT. Omana talked about one very important hotspot concerning chemicals and hazardous substances. And I will not be covering, for example, end of life or social environmental impacts and the resource extraction. So I'll be giving a snapshot, but most of the recommendations and the statements we are making in this presentation actually lead to a total environmental impact reduction of the ICT, which of course impacts other hotspots as well. So to start with, my name is Siddharth Prakash, and I've been working at the OCO Institute for about 13 years in the field of sustainable consumption and production with focus on information and communication technologies. And I've been working for the OCO Institute, which is an independent organization. It's a non-for-profit organization. It provides research-based advice to policymakers in the European Union, national state-level ministries, companies, foundations, NGOs, and also international development organizations. So we have about three offices, about 170, 180 employees, who are working for us. And we complete about 400 national and international projects per year in different fields like climate and energy policy, sustainable consumption, of course, and resources, infrastructure management, nuclear engineering, and we also have lawyers who look into the environmental law related issues. So starting with the ICT hotspots, I just wanted to show you the graph, which shows on the left-hand side, the per capita per year CO2 footprint of an average citizen in Germany. So it's about 12 tons of CO2 per person per year, which is allocated to average citizen in Germany. And in order to reach our climate goals and in order to be climate friendly, achieve climate friendly lifestyles, it needs to be reduced to about 2 tons and even less per capita per year. And if you look at the third bar, which is the smaller one, the gray color, it says it gives you an overview of how much per capita annual CO2 emissions are allocated to information and technologies alone. So it's about a little less than 1 ton. So it's almost half of the total ICT related CO2 emissions. It's only half of the emissions which need to be which are allowed to be emitted so that we can reach our climate targets. So it's a lot. So, and you can see in the pie chart on the right hand side that the manufacturing of ICT devices like laptops and smartphones has the largest share of CO2 emissions in the whole life cycle of products. And apart from that, the green color of the pie chart on the right hand side, you can see a large part of emissions is also located to the data centers. So that means the infrastructure, which is the backbone of all the digital devices, digital networks, and a digital economy in total. Look, going forward, we can see the example of the smartphones, and the graph shows you the percentage distribution of life cycle based greenhouse gas emissions of different smartphone models. So you can see that the majority of the CO2 emissions are allocated to the manufacturing phase. So depending on the study, of course, and the modeling, so you can see that more than 70 to 80% of the total CO2 emissions of a smartphone happens during the manufacturing, during the production. The statement is also applicable for other ICT devices like notebooks and of course all battery-led devices, which are quite efficient in the energy and in the use phase, because that ensures a longer durability of the battery if you're using the energy in a more efficient way in the use phase. So that of course shifts the focus towards the manufacturing phase in terms of the distribution of life cycle-based greenhouse gas emissions. And that actually tells us that when it comes to defining policy instruments, that for such devices, it's important to target the manufacturing phase in terms of reducing the impact, because a lot of developments have already taken place in the use phase in terms of policy development. So how does the distribution of greenhouse gas emissions in the production of a typical ICT product, for example, in this case, notebook, looks like? So you can see that out of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the production of a notebook, only 3 components contribute with the majority of the share. So it's the main board, it's the solid state drive, and it's the memory, the RAM. So if you are able to reduce the production related impact of these 3 components, we can achieve a substantial reduction in the total production phase based environmental impact of ICT devices. And of course, other devices also have an impact, like displays and the batteries, but these 3 components have the largest share. We know that the ICT devices are not used as long as they should be in terms of the environmental impact. In terms of reducing the environmental impact, it's important to use them for as long as possible. And what we did a calculation for different devices, including smartphones, laptops, and TVs. So there we modeled the current average lifetimes compared to the lifetimes what consumers would expect from these devices. So if these devices last as long as consumers want them to last, then for Germany, we calculated the annual greenhouse gas emission reduction due to lifetime extension of these devices to be almost 4 million tons of CO2 per year, and just for these 4 devices. in terms of costs, because we know that there's always an argument that climate-friendly, environmental-friendly devices come with a cost, and it doesn't really pay off in terms of investing in highly priced products because the costs are so high. So we calculated life cycle costs in terms of savings of when buying durable devices and repairable devices, and we calculated about 4 billion euros per year can be saved from on the consumer side if these devices are used longer. We did a comparative calculation of two computer workplaces with notebooks in a federal authority in Germany. And there we compared a notebook which is used for only 3 years in the workplace compared to a notebook which is used for 6 years, because it can be repaired, because the battery could be exchanged, because the memory could be upgraded. So even though these spare parts needed to be replaced and shipped and transported and built into the devices, we saw that there was a substantial reduction potential with the durable devices. And in Germany, we calculated that if all the notebooks, or at least 1/3 of all the workplaces with notebooks, their service life is increased to 6 years rather than 3 years, more than 70,000 tons of CO2 emissions can be saved. And it also translates to savings of about 95 million euros per year in this observation period. So this is an interesting graph which shows how much product should last from climate perspective. So on the left-hand side, you see the average lifetimes for smartphones, 3 years. And if you look at the graph, it says that the optimal lifetime from climate perspective should be as long as 25 to 232 years. And of course, we know that these lifetimes are totally unrealistic, but these graph shows the bigger picture, the perspective, how unsustainable our lifestyles are in terms of using these digital devices. For notebooks, you can see that the minimum optimal lifetime should be as long as 20 years. And we know that on an average, the notebooks are not used then for more than 5 years. So product lifetime extension is the most important strategy to reduce the environmental impact of ICT products. That's the first major statement which I would like to make. Coming to the second hotspot, it's about a data center. So we know that these are the backbones of all our digital lifestyles. So the social media, the video streaming, the Netflix, the Google search, e-commerce, e-banking, everything is related to it goes back to the services which are provided by the data centers. And these are like kind of the invisible problems, I would put it that way, because they are very important. It's a critical infrastructure for all of us. But at the same time, very few of us know that they contribute, they have a very high share of electricity consumption of a country, of an economy. So looking into the different studies, the share of electricity consumption worldwide ranges between 2 to 8% of the total, or let's say currently about 1 to 4% of the total electricity consumption of a country. That goes back to data centers. And in 2030, it's expected to increase up to 8% of the total world electricity consumption. In terms of CO2 emissions, we know that even today, the data centers have an equivalent share of or amount of CO2 emissions as the aviation industry, so whole international or national flight industry. So this is the magnitude we are talking about. We did a calculation in a study together with our partners for Malaysia last year, and we calculated that there about 7% to 8% of the total national electricity consumption goes back to the data center. So it's a very high relevant share, and it's interesting that not a lot of policy instruments are in place right now to handle this problem. And we know that this demand for data processing, storage, and transmission will increase in the future. And also, of course, with the evolvement of new technologies, for example, the 5G network, but also our increasing demand in terms of digital formats. Third hotspot goes back to software. Normally, we talk a lot about hardware when we talk about the ICT related problems. And the thing is that I mentioned, a lot of effort has gone in the past in optimizing the hardware in terms of energy efficiency, etc. But now we are entering into a digital software-led economy. So, and we know that softwares have a high influence on the energy consumption of hardware, of local devices, and this is not always very clear to people. So what we did in one of our studies was to compare the different software solutions for various applications. So for example, you can see that for the same functionality of word processing, a software can lead to a 4-time higher energy consumption than a different software. And in terms of three browsers, we saw that a browser can have, for example, you can see this number 2 browser, the green one, double the amount of energy consumption of the local device compared to other browsers. And the same with content management systems. So depending upon which content management system you are using, the energy consumption of the local device will vary. The internet browsers in this case specifically also lead to different hardware utilizations in the idle mode. So you can see that one browser which we looked into had almost 12 times, 13 times higher hardware utilization than the others. So, and these are all based on real measurements. So it's not the data, let's say desktop research, but that's the measurements we made at a typical working environment. The third problem related to software is a software-induced obsolescence. So when you, for example, the software solutions, as they evolve, sometimes they lead to a problem with the backward compatibility of the hardware. So a new requirements, software requirements, in many cases lead to hardware obsolescence because the hardware is not able to meet the requirements, system requirements. And of course, as in many cases, the hardwares are not able to keep up with the development of the software. So this is also need to be kept in mind, because when you talk about the software developers, or when you purchase a software and it is developing at a much higher pace than the hardware can keep up pace with, then that would also lead to an obsolescence of the hardwares. And we know that many software solutions are not independent on, they strongly depend on the platform to be used. So they are bound to one specific platform and not platform independent. There are several instruments. I think Rakesh talked about that in the slide as well in the beginning at the EU level to reduce the environmental impact of products. We have the eco-design to cut out the least sustainable products. And we have the voluntary instruments like the Green Public Procurement, the eco-label, which seek to support innovations by setting ambitious standards to make the market move towards more sustainability. And of course, we have another pull instrument called the energy label, which has really led to at least a transformation in the sector in terms of improved energy efficiency of appliances. This is the graph shows the impact of the Eco Design Directive in terms of primary energy savings. So we could see that, for example, for electronics, the 7% of the primary energy saving were realized compared to the business as usual. But of course, these calculations are based on only the savings calculated on the basis of energy efficiency in the use phase. And if you remember, we talked a lot about the focus which needs to be shifted on the targets which need to be met at the production phase. So extending the lifetime of the appliances by repairability, reusability, durability. This is something which has not yet happened at a very large scale in the EU Eco Design Directive. In the EU Eco, we have the European Green Deal, as also mentioned by Rakesh in the, earlier on. There, now it is quite clearly mentioned that efficient use of resources is key to contribute towards the climate targets, climate neutrality by 2050, and cutting the greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030. So the fundament, or one of the building blocks, is of course the EU Economy Circular Action Plan, where the efficient use of resources for achieving our climate goals has been highlighted. And of course, electronics and ICT are one of the key value chains which have been mentioned there, talking about the minimum standards, of course, but also talking about the powers of the consumers and the public buyers in leading to transformation. The Sustainable Product Policy Initiative has been launched by the European Commission to address the existing market and regulatory failures, because we know that existing initiatives and the ambition levels of the initiatives are not strong enough to lead to, let's say, internalizing the external costs. So we know that now the focus needs to shift, focusing on the looking at the ICT sector towards achieving longer product lifetimes, towards realizing more durable and repairable products. And this is something which is in line with the true waste hierarchy, which means the waste prevention and the reuse. So that's where the focus should be moving on. And that's what we hope that Sustainable Product Initiative would lead to. They talk about different measures they need to be tested and they need to be looked into. That means revising the eco-design directive. So including even more aspects beyond the use phase energy efficiency, also including the scope in terms of including complex digital services, but also aspects like making the green public procurement or the public procurement mandatory in terms of sustainability requirements. That's an interesting one, and that would be interesting to follow up with. Just a few examples from the EU Eco-Design Directive. The durability related requirements are really at a very nascent stage, so there are not a lot of them for ICT devices. Of course, there is durability requirement for vacuum cleaner motors, for instance, but for ICT, they're only related to a few information requirements with computer servers and data storage products and servers. So not something which is very revolutionary. On the other hand, now the Eco-Design Directive has started to integrate resource efficiency or repair related requirements for many products like the washing machines and the dishwashers, but also for electronic displays, for instance, when it comes to the availability of spare parts, but also access to repair and maintenance information to independent repairers, for instance, or professional repairers. Of course, we are having a discussion right now ongoing in the EU on the smartphones and tablets, where minimum durability and repairability measures are also being discussed, including requirements for the software. So that's a first step. Let's put it that way. I will skip that slide because Rakesh already talked about it. That was about the repairability index in France, and we can have a discussion on that later on if time permits. There are other instruments which are important in terms of pushing for higher durability, better extended lifetime. So these are the so-called consumer protection instruments. So we have the directive on the minimum legal guarantees, which in the minimum requirement the EU is that the product should be defect-free during the time of delivery for at least 2 years. And there are, of course, requirements for designing how the guarantee framework looks like. And recently there is directive on the supply of digital content, digital services. There, the burden of proof in terms of non-conformities lies with the trader for a period of 1 year. So that's something which was different in the past. There, the burden of proof in case of non-conformity on trader was only 6 months. Now it's being extended to 1 year, which gives protection, a little bit higher protection to consumers. But if you remember that the optimal product lifetimes of ICT devices from the environmental perspective need to be much longer, we need to ask the question if this burden of proof limit is still high enough or not. We have eco labels who have some longevity and resource conservation requirements like the Blue Engine. I think Barton will also talk about that later on, so I'll just skip that quickly. I would just like to draw your attention to the criteria for the Blue Angel, the Germany's eco label for data center applications and also for software. So that's something which would be quite interesting also from procurement officer's point of view to see what are the kind of criteria which has been designed for efficient data center operations, but also for climate friendly co-location data centers and software, because that's something a nut which is very, very difficult to crack, how to verify in a reliable manner the compliance of software related criteria. In Germany, as far as clean public procurement is concerned, it has now reached a very high political level in terms of priorities. So it's now being integrated in the Climate Change Act and the Circular Economy Act. So within the Climate Change Act, public procurement has a very central role, and the top objective is to achieve the climate neutrality of federal public administrations until 2030. And there, the procurers are now obliged to prefer climate-friendly products in procurement, and that applies to all phases of procurement. And it's possible to consider the life cycle cost, economic cost of climate change. And that actually was made even more specific with the recent revision in May, where now a CO2 price for preventing causing greenhouse gas emissions in the procurement must be considered. So that's something which is interesting. Of course, there are operational issues in terms of know-how and the knowledge of how this can be implemented in the procurement practice, but at least the legal basis is being now clear. The same applies to the Circular Economy Act. There, it's an obligation to prefer resource efficient products. We formulated a 6-point for the plan for the public authorities for green ICT. So just recapturing all the recommendations and the points I've been making in the presentation, it's important to increase the minimum service life of IT in public authorities. We say a minimum first service life of 6 years, minimum. So first service life, but that should be extended, for example, by enabling a cascading usage. That means passing on the equipment to other companies, enterprises, universities, schools, where even these devices can be used for a longer time. I think it's important that public procurement authorities start developing innovative partnership with the refurbishment companies, companies offering refurbished devices, and to go into the procurement of refurbished device. This is still a very kind of a niche area. And it's important that public authorities use, for example, minimum criteria of eco-labels like Blue Angel, but also if other eco-labels are developing criteria for data center products when tendering for data center services. It's important to have a kind of a forward-looking procurement. That means if you need to, when you procure today, you need to pre-estimate your demand in the future so that you don't end up replacing your hardware within 3 years. But if, for example, if you purchase a software, then the software should ensure that your hardware, the reference product, stays for as long as possible in use. Finally, to conclude with, there's an increasing acknowledgement in the EU policy arena regarding resource efficiency of ICT products, and also complex products like the data center products and services and the software related aspects are now slowly finding their way into the mandatory legislation. But we know that the minimum mandatory requirements are not ambitious and they're not likely to lead to a system transformation. We can talk about that a little bit later on. And we know that voluntary instruments who set ambitious standards, who have, let's say, also the power to move the market, still are not really, they don't have a very high market penetration. So they need to be supported politically and financially. And we know that even going beyond that, we need to change the cost structure of our system. That means that more economic and fiscal measures should be designed for example, for repair businesses, for selling reuse products or repair products. And we need more ambitious consumer protection laws so that consumers who want products to last longer are able to realize those lifetimes also in practice. So thanks a lot. And these are my contact details if you want to be in touch with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Siddharth, for demystifying all the hotspots and the policy measures, but also many of your recommendations and the connection between GPP, eco-labels, and so on. Thank you. Now, looking at all those aspects and the complexity involved in terms of many of those hotspots, many of those criterias, is there a way out to make it easier for purchasers? Well, one example, what you also mentioned briefly, Siddharth, is the use of eco-labels. During the registration process, we asked you which are the eco-labels for ICT products that you are familiar with. And here's the feedback we got. So to take us through with the next steps, we will invite Mr. Barton Finn. He's with TCO Development. That's the organization behind TCO Certified. They are a member of the Global Eco-Label Network. He works together with his team to support purchasers in Western Europe to drive environmental and social responsibility with their tenders. And I think, Barton, the question to be answered is, with all those aspects, with all those hotspots and criteria, how can a purchaser go through this? Yeah, and what should they be looking at to purchase? So maybe you can give us some insights and an example.
Thanks, Rakesh, and also thanks for the invitation and for setting up such an interesting webinar. I must say that I'm really glad to be here today to address these questions in these elements. So yeah, my aim for today will be to give you more information about TCO Certified and how TCO Certified relates to, as you said, the different aspects that have been mentioned by my fellow speakers for the webinar. And in order to do that, let's just maybe start with a kind of quick overview or a reminder about what TCO Development and TCO Certified are all about. So let's maybe start with TCO Development. That's the organization I'm working for. It's an NGO that is based in Sweden, in Stockholm. And the aim of that NGO is really to achieve environmentally and socially responsible and sustainable life cycles for IT products. That's a bit the mission that we have, and this is what underpins everything that we do at TCO Development, all of our activities basically. And the main activity that we are currently busy with is the development and the update of TCO Certified, which is a sustainability certification or eco-label for IT products. But what does that mean? To be in reality a sustainability certification for IT products? Well, it means that on the one hand, we are busy developing, selecting and refining criteria, sustainability criteria or sustainability requirements in relation to the social and the environmental impacts of IT products. So basically what we do is to develop criteria in order to address all the different aspects that were presented previously, or at least as much as possible. So here, just to give you an overview of the types of areas that are included in the types of sustainability criteria and requirements that we include in TCO Certified, you see that here we try to be as comprehensive as possible by trying to tackle all of the different issues that are connected to the ICT products industry today. So here it's just an overview. We have over 50 criteria per product category, but at least here it gives you an overview of the different important families or the criteria families or the impact areas that we include as part of TCO Certified. And so here you can see that we focus on the social dimension, so the working conditions in the supply chains and in the factories, and the environmental dimension with the impacts of IT products and some other considerations such as product lifetime extension, as it was mentioned by Siddharth, but also some considerations with regards to the health and safety of users. So that's the first part of our activity, I would say, developing these criteria in order to make sure that based on these criteria, we can tackle and address the different issues of the IT product industry. And the second part of our work is busy with verification. So the second part of the work is to basically verify that the products that are presented to us by brands are actually meeting the criteria that we have developed and that we have selected. And so that's what we call the actual certification or verification process, where we will check that the products and the working conditions in the factories are fulfilling with all of our criteria. So that's what we do in a nutshell. We develop criteria and then we check that these criteria are being respected by the products that are presented to us and that brands apply for certification. And if we see that, yes, these products are complying with our requirements, then we issue a certificate that basically demonstrates compliance with these requirements. So that's in a nutshell what TCO Certified is all about. And the last thing that I think is important to mention before diving into the details of how do we relate to some of the developments that have been presented, I think it's important to mention that the main aim of TCO Certified is to be a tool that will enable stakeholders of an ICT purchasing process. So it's about brands and purchasers, institutional purchasers. It's the idea of TCO Certified is really to be a tool that is addressed to these types of stakeholders so that they can together meet and establish a kind of connection in order to be able to together drive the needed improvements that we already discussed. So in that sense, I think that we can really say that, yeah, TCO Certified is a kind of platform with the aim of bridging purchasers, institutional purchasers, and the industry, so that they can together work on delivering the needed changes. And in being that platform, we really try to overcome some of the challenges that these stakeholders might face in implementing and in driving more sustainability for the IT industry. So quickly, if we look at the institutional purchasers side, well, of course, any organization nowadays is under pressure in order to deliver on sustainability. And I think that more and more there is a realization that procurement plays an important part in the activities of any organization when it comes to their footprint. Environmental and social footprint. So from that perspective, purchasers are starting to look at ways to address that and to deliver on these expectations. And from that perspective, it's a bit tough for them to build the necessary expertise in terms of the sustainable procurement of all of the different procurement categories that they are buying. And so from that perspective, they are looking for ways such as TCO certified that will help them to address these different and to deliver on these expectations by relying on our criteria and on our verification system. Another important aspect in these challenges faced by purchasers is the risk, the importance of verification and the risk of, or the cautious that they have to put in place in relation to greenwashing and blue washing. And so from that perspective, having platforms such as TCO certified, providing this third-party verification and guarantees is also something that is really useful for them. If we look at the industry side, well, of course, as any organization, the industry is also expected to deliver on sustainability. But I think that when it comes to the IT product industry, there is also some expectations in relation to transparency. And so that's also where TCO certified can come in by providing this third-party assessment and of the different credentials of their products and of their operations. And they're also looking for effective ways in order to show compliance with certain standards and certain requirements. In that sense, TCO certified is also something that they can use in order to overcome these challenges. And then last but not least, there is also an interest in harmonization. An interest from the industry in harmonization, because currently what we see is that it can be also hard for them to cope with different expectations that may be sometimes contradictory. So it's really useful for the industry to have a clear direction from the customers on what areas do their customers want to see them prioritizing in terms of sustainability, so they can really structure the work and knowing that they will answer to the expectations of the purchasing side as a whole. So that's really what we try to achieve and what makes TCO certified, this platform for sustainable IT purchasing. And what I would like to do now with the minutes I have left is to focus on some of the aspects that we include in this system that are really making this bridge between purchasers in industry, and that creates value for both of these stakeholders. So let's maybe start with the verification ID, and that is really important because the verification and the verification framework will really be that element that will provide clarity and that will build credibility and the trustworthiness also for both stakeholders. So verification is really important in as part of our system. On the left, you have a visual illustration of how the verification and the certification process works. I could talk about it for an hour at least, but so I'll just try to focus on the main elements here. And what is really important is to first of all mention that this process starts with an application. So it starts when a brand applies for the certification of one product, and that application will really trigger a verification process. And what is really important to know about the verification process is that it is ongoing. In the sense that we will do some verification before that certificates are being issued, but we will also continue to do the verification after that certificates are being issued. And that is really important to, as I said, build the credibility and the trust element of that of the system. The second important element about the verification system is the idea of independent verification. So we work TCO certified, TCO development together with the verification partners such as TUV Rhineland. We work in order to make sure that, all the criteria that are included in TCO certified are actually being verified and are checked for compliance. And so we do this through product testings in laboratories and through the review of the factory inspections. And we always work with independent and qualified and accredited bodies for carrying out these types of verification. So that is also really important. And I think that that's what builds the comprehensiveness of the verification system, this idea of ongoing verification and this idea of independent verification. And I think that is what really creates value for both the industry and purchasers who are part of the TCO certified framework. And last but not least, still in this idea of verification, I think what is really important also to mention is that in the criteria of TCO certified, we refer to a lot of legislations or relevant standards. And so from that perspective, TCO certified can really be used as proof of compliance with these legislations and standards. So we mentioned the EU GPP previously. Well, we include some of the EU GPP in TCO certified. So it can be used as a proof of compliance with the EU GPP or some of the EU GPP. It's the same for the ILO core conventions or the French repairability index. So from that perspective, we really try to harmonize with relevant legislations and standards in order to also provide that verification element in relation to these. Moving on, the second aspect, which I think really builds TCO certified as this platform for sustainable ICT purchasing, is the relationship between our criteria and legislations. So as I just mentioned, we include a lot of legislation in the criteria, but our standards, but we actually go beyond a lot of those. And I think that this is already also really what is so important for purchasers, because for them it means that by getting part in the TCO certified framework, they are asking their suppliers not to only implement what is required by law, but that they are actually asking them to go beyond. And for the industry, it's also a way, by adhering to the TCO certified framework, it's also a way to stay ahead of legislations by knowing that you are, in relation to some of them, that you are already a few steps ahead. So the example here that I would like to take in order to illustrate that is our work around chemicals and hazardous substances that are included in TCO certified products. So here, if we look at legislations, so ROS and REACH for the European Union, we see several issues with these legislations, and the main issue is that they are based on a negative and restrictive approach. So basically, ROS and REACH, we could summarize that these are lists of substances that cannot be used or that cannot be used above certain thresholds on products that are being put on the EU market. And even if it's a positive step, banning what is bad and banning the bad substances, it creates some issues with the substitutes that are being used in order to replace these substances. So what we see currently is that whenever a substance is needed and that this substance has been banned according to ROS or to REACH, an alternative is being used, but the issue is that we don't have any knowledge about the impacts of that alternative on human health or the environment. And as legislations are always a bit lagging behind, the issue is that it takes some time before these alternatives are being assessed and before we know whether or not they have impacts on human health and the environment. And so that approach is basically summarized by the bottom part of the graph that you see now, where, well, untested substances are being used, and then maybe we find out that they can be hazardous, and then they are banned, and then a replacement is needed. And so here we really felt that we had to switch the logic and that we had to go beyond, because in order to deliver on what we wanted to achieve. And so that's why we came up with the idea of the TCO certified accepted substance list. And the idea of this substance list is, as I said, to switch the logic by only authorizing the use of substances, in the case of TCO certified flame retardants and plasticizers, only using substances that have been previously assessed, so prior to their use, as safer from a human human health and environmental perspective. And that's how we try to really, instead of only banning what is bad, how we try to also drive the use of safer chemicals and of making these safer chemicals mainstream. So I think that that's also really an important element that builds this trust and the value for procurement stakeholders in relation to TCO certified. Yeah, last but not least, I think the accountability element is also something that is really important in the TCO certified system. And here, what I would like to mention is the accountability that we are building with brands and with factories in relation to supply chain sustainability. And we are doing this with the TCO certified accepted factory list. So here, I guess the logic is a bit the same as we have with the TCO certified accepted substance list, but with factories. So the idea here is that only factories that are mentioned in the TCO certified accepted factory list are authorized to produce and to manufacture TCO certified products. And by if a factory wants to be added to that list, it needs to agree to a certain framework and a structured work in relation to sustainability. So what happens in a really summarized way is that whenever a factory wants to be added to the list or wants to remain in the list, the factory will have to submit the results of a factory inspection, so through a social audit of the factory. And based on the results of that initial inspection, what we will do is that we will, first of all, develop a corrective action plan with clear deadlines and recommended actions on what needs to be implemented in order to bring the factory into the desired stage or state. And so that's the corrective action plan. And we will also develop or attribute a risk category to that factory. And what will happen then is that based on the corrective action plan, we will do regular follow-up with that factory in order to make sure that the implementation of the different actions that were mentioned in the corrective action plan is being done, and that the factory is working proactively with implementing the needed changes. And based on that work and the follow-up work that we're doing, that will basically determine whether or not the risk category of a factory will be maintained, increased, or lower. And that's really where that's the key of the system, in the sense that this is providing the carrot and the stick at the same times to factory, in the sense that when we see, as part of the follow-up procedures that we have with factories, when we see that one factory is proactively implementing the actions that we asked the factory to implement, then it means that the factory is really willing and cooperative with us. And so from that perspective, the risk category of that factory will be lowered. And with a lowered risk category, the frequency and the intensity of our follow-up procedures will also be lowered, because the factory has showed good progress, and I show that a proactive commitment in delivering the needed changes. And on the other hand, that allows us to focus and to double down on the factories where we see a lot of issues and where we don't see the commitment that we will have, that we want to see in relation to implementing the changes that have been recommended. So from that perspective, the risk category of these types of factories that are not proactively committing to working as part of our framework will be increased. So it means that the intensity and the frequency of our follow-up procedures in relation to that factory will also be increased. And here, of course, still in that accountability element, we have some consequences for the factories that will where we don't see where we see continuously a lack of commitment to providing the needed improvements, and so these different consequences can go through the withdrawal of certificates or the withdrawal of the ability for a factory to produce TCO certified products. So that's how we are really working on, turning supply chain sustainability into good business with the carrot and the stick approach at the same time. So that's basically everything that I wanted to cover with you today. If you are interested in the elements I presented, we are extensively discussing these in the last report that we have published. So I really encourage you to have a look. You can easily find it back on our website. And we have other resources as well, reports, webinars, and guidance. So feel free to have a look at those as well. And if you have any question, feel free to ask it now, or you have my contact details now. So really feel free to contact us.
Right. Thank you, Barton. After Siddharth kind of unpacked all the impacts on the environmental side and Omana stress upon the social challenges, thank you for showing us how criteria has been incorporated and how TCO development and TCO certified is like in this continuous process of updating so as to allow procurers to look at the label and hopefully fulfill many of those requirements. Having heard from Barton, I think, Ryan, now is a good time to put up the poll and what the audience feels with regards to eco-labels. What do we feel? What is necessary and important aspects to be reviewed to be considered and to be included within eco-labels? That these labels have criteria which are based on product environmental footprint aspects, let's say the hotspots, that these labels should include both the social and environmental criteria, that there should be some kind of a global harmonization, and that should be enforcement by purchasing practices of governments to say, well, we will purchase products which have those eco-labels by law. That maybe these labels, eco-labels, can be based on self-declaration, or if you feel that there should be a third-party verification. And then finally, if these labels and the criteria should be continuously updated. So, I mean, we heard how all of these are important aspects, but if you had to pick up three, which three criteria would you select that you would say is essential for an eco-label to be robust and to be credible? So Ryan, if we have the feedback and response, perhaps we can put it on the screen. Okay, thank you for that feedback. With regards to third-party verification, that's what you stress upon, Barton. But
I'm
also
glad to see that.
Yes, yeah, me too. But also to see that such criteria should be developed with multiple stakeholders in a transparent approach and should include both the social and environmental aspects. Yeah. So I think everything that you have shared, Omana, but also Siddharth and Barton, it has been well received by the audience. And while we go into the Q&A session, if we consider that we are in this age of continuous electrification and that the ICT industry and ICT products are on this pathway to greater progress and greater responsibility on social and environmental aspects, do you feel, now it's back to you as panelists and experts, that the roots of this tree, which is growing and growing fast, does it have sufficient nutrition in terms of policy, in terms of demand, in terms of framework for rewarding performance by financial investors with standards and so on? Maybe we get a word from each one of you before we start looking at the questions. Omana, from your perspective, are electronics and is the industry on this pathway to increase and improve social and environmental responsibility? Does it have all the nutrients for its roots?
It's definitely on the path, but I think there's a long way to go in terms of really making bringing more accountability, bringing more transparency, especially when I talk from the perspective of occupational health and safety. We still have a long way to go, but I can say that it's a good start. We are on that pathway.
Okay.
And with consistent engagement, we will get there eventually.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And Umana, maybe one more follow-up question. We've heard about what's happening in Europe. We've heard about electronic watches engagement also in Asia with several universities and purchasers. If after 2 years we were to talk again, what do you hope you will be sharing with the audience in 2023?
I really hope that I can optimistically say that if we have more affiliates in the Asian region, especially university bodies and organizations holding public buyer interest, then we hope that we could have completed some successful monitoring on the ground. We hope that we have been able to address the problems we've seen inside the workplaces. And most importantly, we hope that workers are a part of the process of remediation and bringing changes in the workplace. And that's what I hope to tell you in the future.
Okay. All right. Let's all hope and work towards that. Thank you, Umana. Then Siddharth, you and your organization works extensively, of course, with the European institutions, but you also shared that you support governments in the Asia region, in the Asian continents. What do you feel? Does this tree of green ICT in Asia, does it have the right kind of nutrition and support so that it's firmly on the way to greater progress and moving higher?
Yeah, okay. When you specifically talk about Asia, I would think that the range of instruments we have at the European level are not present at the Asian level at this point of time. So at least we would say that this mix of instruments, like the minimum mandatory requirements like eco-design and the stronger consumer protection laws in Asia are required. I mean, the EU, we have now experience, so we have a range of instruments. They need to be more ambitious. So what we need is, if you also asked me the same question like you did to Umana, like in 2 years, I would say that at least the bigger economies in Asia should have started developing their minimum mandatory legislation for ICT products like the eco-design.
Okay. Thank you for that feedback, Siddharth. And then Barton, what is your perspective? What do you hear from your clients, from your stakeholders for the world, but also for Asia, with regards to, does it have what it needs to make sure that this green ICT and fair ICT wave is moving ahead?
Yeah, I think when I look at everything that has been said, I think all the main elements of the puzzle are already there or in their way of being delivered. So I think that from that perspective, yes, but if I had to insist on something, I would probably insist on implementation. And that's, I'm more an expert of the European context, and what I have seen here is that a lot of interesting tools, a lot of interesting standards are being developed, a lot of interesting initiatives, but what is really important is to commit to those and to really implement them and being consistent in the implementation. So yeah.
Okay, all right. Thank you. We are a couple of minutes over time, so I want to say thank you, Umana, Siddharth, and Barton for also responding to the questions which were coming up through the chat and to the Q&A. We will pass on the unanswered question to our experts and share the feedback with all the participants. And I want to say then, thank you very much, Umana. Thank you very much, Siddharth. Thank you very much, Barton. And thank you very much for all the participants for joining us, for listening. Please take care. And thank you, Ryan, for making sure that everything works well. Then please take care. And until later.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.